Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed organizations. My name is Pilar and I'm the director of Virtual Not Distant, a company where we help managers of remote teams to get the most out of online collaboration. You can find out everything we do over at virtualnotdistant.com. Hello and welcome to another episode of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast. I'm your host, Pilar, and with me today is, someone who, if you've been listening to the show for a while, you will have heard him come on and talk about different things over different years, during different centuries almost. So you will know Mark Kilby, who is a remote Agile practitioner. And I met Mark many years ago. We had dinner, didn't we? We walked around South Kensington. We met in person.
We did with a few other remote folks that we knew in common, and that was a lovely dinner. That was a wonderful time. I still have pictures from that. Yeah,
we have pictures. That's amazing. And then we went to South Kensington. I showed you my alma mater, Imperial.
Yeah, we toured the campus.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a beautiful campus too.
It is.
But do I still have the record for your podcast? Do I have the most visits?
Yes, I have to say you do. I haven't counted, but this one definitely, and probably you have one a year at least. So that's a record as well. So listeners, the reason why I wanted to catch up with Mark, with you as listeners, is that recently I attended a presentation he did for the virtual Agile meetup, and he touched on a couple of things that I've been hearing people asking for advice on, and also just some general concepts around working in a remote environment. And if you're in a hybrid organization and you've got real flexibility, then I think you're also you're a subset of remote. I want to put it out there. I'm not the only one saying it.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Mark, let's just dive straight into it. And I think let's go to the first thing that in random order of my notes. One of the things we were talking about, and that managers, especially senior leadership, are struggling with in organizations, is staying visible, in inverted commas.
Yeah.
And it requires a different mindset, and it requires a different way of being visible rather than walking around or having meetings and stuff. So what are your thoughts around this? What are some of the things that you've been seeing and people do? What are your thoughts around this?
We've also, Johanna Rothman and I, in our book, From Chaos to Successful Distributed Agile Teams, we talk about this quite a bit in the book. But rather than cover the book, I'll tell you a particular story, because I shared this in that talk as well. There was one senior VP of product that I worked with not too long ago, who had a great way of approaching this. So as important information needed to be shared, he wanted to make sure that people would receive the information different ways, and they could access him to ask questions and feel more certain about what the changes meant for them. So he would, if there was a pivot coming in a product or something a competitor was doing that he thought the company should know about, he would usually put out blog posts first thing Monday morning, and everyone read his blog post. So they knew, hey, if this fellow put it out there, it's worth reading. And he was a good writer too, so that helped.
It does.
Yeah, he was a very good writer. On middle of that same week, on a Wednesday, he would have an all hands meeting where there would be other topics, but he would also bring up the topic that he presented in the blog post and just kind of summarize it and say, if you want more information, you didn't see it, you can read the blog post. And if you have questions, now's a great time. Some would ask questions, but of course, some were not comfortable asking it in a large group of a couple hundred people. So he also made a point of either later in the week or as we got bigger, the following week, he would have a couple of AMAs, Ask Me Anything sessions. And because we were a global team, he would have them at different times, usually 2 or 3, to make sure he covered all the time zones and gave everyone at least a couple of opportunities to sit in on one of these. so that they could ask questions, especially if they felt it impacted them, whatever the news was. And people could ask open, honest questions. And then sometimes he might even come back again and do a follow-up to his blog post and say, hey, I got some really good questions. I just want to make sure everyone had these answers. So he would just make sure he would kind of put the message out there, get feedback, and made sure that any responses that might be of interest to the entire company, he would share that out again. So he kind of went back and forth with that. And he would do that really on a bi-weekly basis. So not every 2 weeks was he doing a big blog post, but just when he did that, he would follow that pattern, and people knew, oh, okay, he's got something important to share. We've got some opportunities to ask him about it.
It does remind me a lot of what you would do as a content creator online. Like, the advice of social media, you have something written in text, you have something that is, well, in this case, it's a live video thing. And then you have the smaller groups, or even the Ask Me Anything. Was the Ask Me Anything one-to-ones?
It was usually small groups, like no more than, actually, he would limit to like 7 or 8.
Okay, nice.
Yeah.
So a small group. Yeah. And what this brings to mind as well, I mean, one, it sounds like a lot of work because it's, but and you're going, which is great because
well,
is it?
I look at it this way: it's a lot more work if you don't communicate.
Yeah. And it does.
And he understood that.
Yes, and it does take that mindset of, before maybe just with one meeting it was enough because I could have a big meeting, then afterwards in the corridor, the people who didn't want to ask anything in the open could grab me later, or someone, there's more information and communication flows in different bits and pieces when you're all located in the same environment. But when you're distributed, well, this is another way of using different channels, but you've got to be that more deliberate. And again, if you don't have that structure, the information does not flow.
Yeah. And of course we were using Slack in this organization, so he would get direct messages. But what he found was if he followed that pattern, he got fewer direct messages because people knew they would have these opportunities to speak with him. And so it turned down the individual interrupts and still gave people access to him to ask about what is the big news that you're sharing.
So in a way, what you were saying, it does in the long run, it does save you time, actually.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And if you leave it to the rumor mill to share the news, you have a lot of cleanup that you have to do. And I'm sure several of the leaders can understand what work that can be.
And this is a great example to follow, not just for, I mean, most organizations now have this degree of remote setup because there's so much internal communication. I mean, come on, all the newsletters and all the intranet stuff comes. We really, the way of communicating in most organizations is online. So we're following that pattern. So this is also a great example for any change management experience as well. And any time that we want to be visible and, like you say, making sure that the right information is getting out there in all these different ways.
Yeah. And so it's being deliberate about not just what channels you choose and when, but setting a pattern to how you use those channels. So if people miss the initial announcement, they know to go look for it because that's the pattern he followed. They knew there was a blog post. They just had to go find his page and read the blog post if they missed it.
And of course, people can then choose their modes of communication. It could be, I know some leaders are doing videos, it's maybe instead of blog post. And I think that's really important, very interesting. So with this, there was something also in the talk that I don't know if someone actually asked the question or if it's something that came up around this pervasive communication, as in communication that's disseminated and through different channels and it's happening out, versus transparency. Is this transparency or is transparency something else?
So there's a for me, there's a subtle distinction, and this is something else we talk about in the book, but transparency is making it easy to access information. Pervasiveness is making sure information goes out on specific channels. So the example of that senior VP, he used the blog, he used the the synchronous all hands meeting. He used some synchronous also AMAs because these sometimes these news items he had would bring up some concerns. And yes, you could deal with that asynchronously, but it's really hard to get the emotional information sometimes. And so he'd like to have those synchronous touch points just to gauge how are people reacting to the news, and then he could back off into doing things asynchronously in Slack or email.
I think that the distinction between the synchronous and the asynchronous is also very important, as in that synchronicity for some employees, that would be very important because maybe getting information asynchronously from him wouldn't be enough. It would feel too removed. Whereas as soon as you're in real time, that might feel closer.
Yeah. And hence why we use the term pervasiveness for that is to making sure that important information, not all information, but important information that everyone in the organization needs to know, does get out to people a couple different ways and a couple different times, so that they can react to it and they have those opportunities to react and find out more and not just be broadcast to.
And so an example of transparency in this case, would it be, for example, that, say, senior leadership has made a decision and they communicate the decision and, maybe something around it, but actually then maybe they have documentation on how they came across that decision somewhere that people can look for it, but they're not necessarily pushing it out? Would that be?
Well, and it's a little bit more than that. Sometimes when you have those lovely org chart trees, there's invisible walls around each part of those trees, as we know, and the assumption is communication only goes up and down. But in a remote organization, that can kill it unless you allow other teams to see what they're doing. So if you have like an infrastructure team that works with different product teams, can they look at each other's work? Can they just peek in and see easily, or do they have to go up the chain and down the chain to get that information? And for most high functioning remote organizations, they find ways to make as much transparent as possible so that there's nobody in the way to answer a question. You can go directly to whatever the information source is. So that's the importance of the transparency.
That's great, the transparency, because I think a lot of time when we talk about transparency in organizations, we talk about a top-down approach rather than that horizontal, which is so important. Can you give us some examples? Can you think of ways in which organizations are doing that? Like, for example, I heard the other day, which was lovely, someone who is organizing, they are online meetings, but they're organizing online meetings between the different teams just to share what they're doing. So that's one way of transparency. Yep. Have you got any other moments?
Oh, yes. So a few things that I've done is having those informal kind of meetings. If you're familiar with AMAs, then sort of another variation of that, which comes from the Agile world, is what's called lean coffee. And this is a self-organizing meeting where whoever gathers, they kind of put the agenda together in the moment. They all vote on the topic, so you can see what's most important to those who've gathered, and you go through that. This works great if you get a mix of different people or different teams in that, because sometimes one person from one team might say, I've never understood how this other system worked. And guess what? We've got somebody from that team who can answer that. And so having some informal gatherings like that. Also, more structured kinds of events like a hackathon where people are gathering to just try something out and they don't have to stay within their existing teams. So they can connect with anybody else in the organization that's participating. And so we've had people from operations and different products all get together and come up with new features, and they're working with people for the first time, but they're seeing how their skills can mesh. Sometimes it can be even simpler than that, and just having informal channels. And you see this usually start with a water cooler type of channel. But if you can allow the individual team members to spin up their own kind of special interest groups. So in one organization, uh, we had a water cooler channel, and it was actually called engineering, and nobody posted anything because it said engineering. As soon as we changed it to water cooler, it's like, oh, now we can post anything. And then people started posting a lot of particular topics, and they said, can we have a motorcycle channel? Sure. Can we have a game board channel? Sure. And you know what? You could set up your own channel. Just use this format. And so we had SIG for special interest groups. So people knew these were informal channels. This is where they could go. And at one point we had like 40 different ones. But the interesting thing was, and I think I've shared this before with you, people start to learn about each other and their skills because some were technical topics. And as new products or new teams formed, the first people they think about working with is the ones they met through these informal channels. And so it's really easy to form new teams that way.
Again, this is another thing that is being missed in traditional organizations who've experienced remote, have some form of remote work still in the organization, but they're thinking that all of the networking needs to happen in person still. And
No.
there's an element of one, community management, I think that's missing. I mean, the people who've been doing the enterprise social networks and stuff for ages keep saying it's just not being adapted and adopted.
Yeah.
I still think that the potential of relationships being created in an asynchronous way, in some way, across organizations, is still not being given enough focus, maybe because people haven't experienced it as well. If you haven't experienced it, you don't know it can happen sometimes.
Yeah. And there's, because of my background and also building some online communities, and you and I have worked a little bit in that area, translating that to inside the organization is key. You've got to have somebody within the organization that is a community builder. And especially those remote or hybrid remote organizations, and how are they looking at connecting people? How are they looking at keeping people informed on what's happening? Not just the statistics of the business, but what's the interesting thing? What's the people connections? And that's something that's always interested me.
So one thing that struck me during the presentation, and that strikes me still now, is so you, of course, you're a remote Agile practitioner. Your background is Agile, all these Agile practices. And if we look, I've always thought, since I came into the remote world as it is now, at the same time as I was discovering Agile. And in fact, I remember people thinking that I was Agile because I haven't got a clue about any of that. But looking at the Agile practices, I was thinking, yes, this is a way of working that is completely suited to remote. And I have a note here of a slide. And again, we were thinking that I'm not sure if this is one slide, a couple of slides, and I just put it together in my mind, where if Agile, if three of the core, I don't know, linchpins or concepts or foundations of Agile are transparency, feedback, and adaptation. And some of the core foundations of remote are choice, focus, and balance. If we add them all together, we've got it's a great model for both Agile and remote.
Yes, and that's why I wanted to point out in that talk was it's not about are you remote or not. It's not if you're hybrid or not. It's do you have some of these elements in your organization? How can you amplify them? How can you make sure that they're available to everybody? And that's what I've always tried, no matter what kind of organization I'm in.
Yeah. And some of the stuff we're talking about, like some of the examples you're giving us around transparency and also pervasive communication, you need a certain culture for that to work. And so I think that if we are thinking about how things might work in our organization or what things we want to try, if we look at this, is the choice, is this focus, balance, is the transparency, feedback on a culture of adaptation, then these things will work very well. But if not, then maybe we need to work on the culture first? And then,
Yeah.
or through, I mean, a question to you, do we need to work on the culture first, or does adopting some of these practices help us to build that culture?
Well, from one part of Agile, the phrase "start where you are" is where comes up often, and I think that's a great way to think about it. Is what is your culture like now? Is it very open? Is it very transparent? Is there we're looking out for each other, or is it something more like I just focus on my own stuff? I'm not worried about collaborating. I just want to get in and out of work. Those are things that maybe are usually not great, no matter what business it is. So how do you get people more into a collaborative mindset? How do you get them sharing information to do that? So that idea of working out loud that we've heard early on in remote work works in many different places, not just remote work.
Nice. And then we won't dwell on this one, but I have to bring it up then. So I'll give you an example, something I wanted to share I think I didn't get to share it at the meetup because we were running out of time. So just a couple of days before that meetup, I'd done a talk around just where we were at with remote work in, what had happened over the last years. And there was an organization that I was talking about who've done really well in terms of putting flexibility first in how people use the office. So they have quite a lot of choice. And funnily enough, there was someone in the call from that organization, and they said, yes, everything was right, because sometimes you hear things and then the reality is different. But she said that's the reality. But then she said, however, well, but for example, we do need to use the office sometimes because we work around Agile. And so we have to have our stand-ups in person. And I thought, okay, where are we, Mark? Where are we then with the remote Agile thing? Because I know that when I first entered the Agile world, there was the Agile Manifesto said we had to be together in person, and there was a bit of resistance about doing Agile remotely. How has that changed? Because I'm sure it's changed. If nothing else, by people like you and Joanna writing books like From Chaos to Distributed Teams.
Yeah, and certainly that last couple of years of the pandemic have forced people into thinking about that, which has I think polarized the question even more. So some couldn't wait to go back in the office, and others are like, this could work. And the funny thing was, Johanna and I are kind of looking over our book sales, and we've actually sold more books this year in 2022 than we did in 2021.
Wow.
And we're like, oh, that's interesting that it's going up. So people are still thinking about that, and we're not the only book out there. There's others out there. There's a ton out there now, actually. But I think people are starting to think about, okay, how the idea of a stand-up, does it really need to be in person? Do we need to be within arm's length of each other? Or can we do it like on a Zoom call like we're doing right now? Which, yes, I've done that. I've done it on phone. I'm not so crazy about the asynchronous stand-ups, but that's me. It does work for some teams. If it gives them what they need to check in with each other and make sure somebody can get some help and the whole team is headed in the right direction, okay. It doesn't work for me though. I like the human, hearing human voices in a stand-up, but that's me.
And again, it's going back to why are we doing this? And if what we really need is the human connection, then we better do it one way. If what we need is a quick sync up of ideas, or like you say, or to make sure that everyone has the space to say, I need help, or to catch up, then we can do it another way. But I think it's really interesting because as soon as you start to, the question is not whether you should do it remote or not, whether you should do it sync or async. The question is, why are you doing it? And I think when you don't have the option of how you do it, you just do it. But when you have the option of how to do it, you've got to go back to why, so you can design.
Yeah. And that's why that choice is important. And if you can give choice to the people who are doing the work, they're going to come up with what works best for them.
Yeah, excellent. So finally, there's one other thing that I wanted to hear more about, and also share with listeners, of course, and it's this concept of the visual management. And you
Hmm.
brought up this, I suppose, framework theory of the 7 elements of visual management that you are looking at the moment. Is it one of your collaborators or someone you know? Where does the idea come
This
from?
this is from Jim Benson and Tony Ann DiMaria, who started Modus Institute. They're also the authors of the Personal Kanban book, and they looked at all the teams they've been coaching, and they not only coach software teams, but they coach construction teams. They've coached hospitals. They've they've coached folks in media. And how do you organize your work? How do you visually track things that make sense to the team and that anybody can get the information they need at any time? And what I like about their approach is it's not trying to shoehorn the team's process into a particular framework like Scrum or Kanban or something like that. It's having the team walk through some steps to think about what's the best way for us to track the state of the work. What triggers something changing? What's the story around the work? Do we understand why?
Mm,
Why we're doing
yeah.
some of this work? Because they could end up doing the completely wrong thing. And also, how do we visually capture our culture so that we maintain it? So how do we, on these visual boards or however you want to do it, Miro, any of those, how do you capture the culture so that anybody that comes in new to the team can say, oh, this is how you guys operate? And also, what does it mean to be professional on the team? So if somebody pushes back, is that a professional opinion? And so trying to capture this in a visual management system so that everyone understands, yes, this is where I can put my opinion in. This is where I can put my professional experience in and not just hang back and be silent because there's a boss in the room or something like that. It's really how can we optimize our collaboration through this visual management?
Nice. And so, can you just talk us through what the 7 elements are, just to start? I mean, I would encourage. We'll put the link in the show notes to the article that you're referring to as well, and we invite listeners to go and look at it. But just as a quick, just to get our brains all fired up.
Sure. Sure. So, and I was giving subtle hints in the way I was describing too, but
Yes.
uh, it starts up at the top of the diagram, which you'll see in the blog post, is what is the state of the work? What's the current things we're working on? What's next? Who's working on it? Uh, the other part is triggers, and how do we know when something should move to another state? Do we need to check certain things? Does somebody in particular need to check the quality of something or do a certain step? What's the longer term plan around the work? So, do we have some milestones or a roadmap? And again, I talked about what's the story or the narrative around the work. Do we understand why? Do we understand the 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 work environment of who we're building this for? Whether it's an article series or a piece of software or a theatrical production, do we understand the impact of this? And then the last parts, which you'll see at the bottom of the diagram, is what's our culture? What do we define as professionalism? And what's the team identity? And what's the individual identity? So, as that last part, which I didn't say as much about, what skills are we bringing? What's important for me to be here? So the rest of this is like what's important for us, but there's also part of what's important for each individual to be there, so we can look for opportunities. So one way that I've always described that when I've mentored others is it's important for you to understand what the team's doing, but it's also understanding why you were attracted to this type of work and where optimizes your skills and what gets you excited about the work. Because if you forget about that, you may not want to be part of the team anymore. So it's a bit of a career element there as well.
Yeah, I like that. I like very much the that we don't forget the self-awareness of the individual in all of this and constantly coming back to that because of course we're working in this case collaboratively in teams with other people. However, to really understand how we can be our best, we need to continuously be asking ourselves these questions. And of course, you and I and other people who go and talk on podcasts and who do consultancy and mentoring, we love talking about this. And I understand that not everyone does, but I think there is an element where you do need to, I think, with because now hopefully more people have more choice. Therefore, I think we do have a responsibility to keep checking in and making sure that the choice makes sense to us for us and for our actually our responsibility to others as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, and and if people share that information, why the work is important to them, if a new opportunity comes up or a change comes up for that individual, it won't be as shocking to the team. It's like, well, yeah, we knew that Mark was always interested in management. That's not true, but but we'll say in this case, um, and so he got an opportunity to take this management position. So that kind of transition is not as shocking to the
Mm.
team because I wonder how many times your listeners have gone to a meeting and they found out a colleague's leaving and they were shocked by that. But if you've got a way to capture that information early on, it's not as shocking. It's more, oh yeah, that's a great opportunity for you. I see that now.
We're going in a way, we're going back to transparency. As
Yes.
in, not that we have to be revealing everything. We never say this, but we do say about okay, there might be value in revealing just a little bit more than we have in the past, so that we're used to it for all these reasons. I mean, we're bringing back the reasons to work and to being able to operate at our best.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And to also keep revisiting that
Mm.
because things change over time. Our priorities change over time. The work changes over time. So make sure you check in on those visual elements.
So then these visual elements, is it something that I think it was called my Trello, my my iPad's gone to sleep. Let me see, the 7 elements of visual management. That was the title
Yes.
of it. So is this something for managers to use? Is this something for the teams to use? And how do we use this framework?
So to answer the first two questions, yes, it's for the managers and the
Yes.
teams because it's the teams that are going to end up using these visual elements, but management has to support this. And if the teams don't know how to use these, it's probably management that has to make sure let's set this up for you. If you're a new team, let's make sure we have this set up and um, and so this is one of the things that I'm actually teaching through Modus Institute and teaching some of these elements both for you know co-located teams as well as remote teams because I really like how they put this together. It resonates with a lot of things I've done over the years with different organizations.
And so is this a question of coming together in a workshop environment and working through them? Or is this something that we look at each element separately? Is this something we have? You mentioned boards that we come to. How does it practically work out thinking through this together?
So I'm going to go back to what does the team need?
Okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
so
yeah.
so if they're starting from scratch, yes, it's probably going to be a couple of workshops. It can actually be, I mean, this sounds like a lot, but you can actually get through this in a couple of days to build this out. You want to spend more than a day because as you're building up these elements, it starts uncovering assumptions. And the team starts asking each other, oh, I thought we were doing this. And so you've got to have a little, you have to have that sort of overnight time for people to process and say, oh, all my assumptions were wrong, or some of these assumptions were wrong. So by splitting that up over a couple of days, you can build it from scratch. But some teams you go into and they have parts of this already in place.
Hmm.
And so you can build off of that. And so in some cases I've come in with teams that already have elements of this and we just add to it. So again, it's that starting where you are kind of concept.
And I'm also thinking that it's got elements of discovery. It might have elements of consolidation. It might have, you say about challenging assumptions or discovering. So there might be an element of challenging our assumptions of where some of this sits. Yeah. And I'm also thinking you could even turn it into a asynchronous exercise over like weeks, where you look at something and you let that asynchronous conversation mull out for a bit, as people think and overlap.
I might be playing an experiment there. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking even overlapping elements, like you can structure it so that you do tackle one element at a time, just for ease of use and stuff. But if you structure it in a way that you can easily come back and revisit, and then, of course, an element of synchronicity is always great as well. But it's really interesting because obviously everything is interlinked and stuff builds on each other. And like you say, it'd be very interesting if this is a longer process, which I think helps it to be a longer process. It means that we can be experiencing the day-to-day and coming back to these elements as well as we are going along. And so there's something in there. There's something in there.
Well, and again, what you come out with is a version of how you'll visually manage. But again, you're going to want to revisit it as things change. So just remember, it's not static. It'll change over time.
That's really important. And it's also not to be left to one side and never and forget about it and not realize when there's clashes with it in how we want to operate. And then, do we want to, is this clash because we've moved on, like you say, or is this clash because we're actually not really embedding our way of working as we wanted to?
Right, because that's where the greatest learning is when you have those clashes. So don't avoid them, dig into them.
Great insight. So, Mark, we are going to leave this conversation. Now, we are recording in mid-November 2022. I need to see when I'm scheduling it. So it might be that this is something for the new year, which would be great because that means that you have a yearly presence on the show. So, Mark, remind listeners now, is it From Chaos to Distributed Teams? Is that the right title?
From chaos to successfully distributed agile teams. Yes, we did not go for a short title. I'm sorry.
Successfully distributed agile teams. And I have to say, I've said this before on this podcast and to people, grab the book, even if you're not an agile team, because a lot of the practices and a lot of the mindset and everything and the stories are applicable to all kinds of teams. So people, please grab it. It's Mark co-authored it with Joanna Rothman. And Mark, where is the best place for people to connect with you?
So they can go to my website, markkilby.com. There's contact info there. I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter, so you can find that info there. But if you're curious more about the visual management elements, I'm also teaching at modusinstitute.com, and you'll see me there on the faculty page.
Excellent. Wonderful stuff. Well, Mark, thank you very much for your time today.
Oh, thank you, Pilar. It's always fun to talk to you.
A big thank you to Ross Winter for polishing the audio of this episode. And thank you, listeners, for choosing to listen to the 21st Century Work Life podcast. Remember to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app, and you can check out the full show notes over at virtualnotdistant.com/podcasts. Talking of podcasts, we have another show you can listen to, Management Cafe, which you should also be able to find on all podcast apps. I have been Pilar Ortiz. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.